Welcome to an episode of Theological Sidebars. It's good to be in the chair today. My office, oh, you don't want to see you back here. It has been, can't get this thing cleaned up yet. Just moved in here. It's been a few weeks. It's disaster zone. So you only see a limited view. It looks somewhat okay. Anyways, today thought I would engage something from the previous week. That's a good discussion to be able to have. So been going through the series in the book of Exodus. We're now in like a mini series on the Ten Commandments. So here's the deal. Today, dealing with this one, honor your father and mother. This is verse 12 of chapter 20. Honor your father and mother so you may have a long life in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Okay, so that piece I want to begin to engage with. Because there's some stuff here that we got to talk about. In fact, some of the passages that I brought up this past week, there are some questions around it about how do we then fulfill this stuff. So like, okay, for instance, Exodus 21, look at here, and let's start with verse 15 here. So let's start with some of this. Whoever strikes his mother and father must be put to death. Now, this is speaking about, if you read the context of all of 21, right, everything in 21 is really generally, I mean, this is all for adults. This is about people. This is not about children. So these are about adults. In fact, the Exodus 20 passage, the Ten Commandments, is about adults and how they treat their parents and honor them. So don't strike. So this is whoever strikes them, right? So if that word strike, right, let's just click it. Let's see what we've got, right? This is to smite. I hate when you get the dictionary one. Let's just see how it's used in the Bible, shall we? So let's get strike. Let's just look at, it's probably going to be strike, defeat, strike down to kill, defeat, attack, right? So this is not just punching, but like, look at, even in context of Exodus. Let me pull this up above my head here. The most recent context in Exodus, some of the most recent stuff, right? He saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, verse 2:12. He struck the Egyptian dead. Why are you attacking? I'll stretch out my hand and strike Egypt. So this is this word. This is not just a simple, this is not talking about kids punching their parents, but adults beating up their parents, right? So that's a big one. And he says, put to death. Next one. Now, I want to come back to this. This is the piece that I want to get to in just a second. Whoever curses his father or mother must be put to death. Okay, and that idea of curse, this is profane, this is to humiliate, to shame. So this is a lot that's involved with just as an adult ridiculing, shaming, humiliating their parents. Now, here's another one that I thought was interesting, and then I'll get to where I want to go from this. So this comes from Deuteronomy 21, and let's look at verse 18 here. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father or mother and doesn't listen to them even after they discipline him. By the way, once again, we're talking about man, right? This is man. This is not child. Okay, I think there's a reason for that choice, but keep going. We'll find out more about this child or this man. Says that his father and mother take hold of him, bring him to the elders of the city gate of his hometown. Says they are to say to the elders of the city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious, and he doesn't obey us. He's a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city will stone him to death, and you must purge the evil from you, and all of Israel will hear and be afraid. Okay, so recognize that. This is talking about a freeloading son. This is talking about one who refuses to take wisdom, direction. This also appears to be a son who still is living within the realm or the sphere of influence of the parents, right? So this is somebody who seems to be in the household, but he's old enough to be a drunkard. He's old enough to be a glutton. He's old enough to just be sitting around and absolutely stubborn, he's rebellious. I mean, let's look even at some of these words right here. Let's look at rebellious, how this is one using. So let me pop this one open as we look here. And so this is rebelling against. All right, so this is not just that they are disobedient, but it's used of people who rebel against the Lord and his commands. So they're not only just disobeying, they're actually actively pushing out against and fighting against the parents here. So that being said, we see that, but here's the thing that I think we still have to talk with. This is the sidebar conversation. Well, I love this channel, Theological Sidebars. is what do we do with this? Especially when you find it says they will stone him to death, or if you curse him, you put him to death, right? So we have these laws, these Old Testament laws that say that disobedience to parents, cursing the parents, the freeloading, rebellious stubbornness, the drunkenness, that stuff is all punishable by death. So necessarily the question then pops up is, okay, what does that mean for us today? Okay, so let me try to break this down because I think it's a good conversation. Okay, first and foremost, let's start with the easy stuff, right? Easy is all of those are instances of what it means to dishonor your family. So, and by the way, remember, these are geared really towards adult children, okay? So we know what it's teaching us is these are things that are what disobedient, dishonoring children do, okay? That's important. We should look at that and say, look, if you've got children that are doing this, this is dishonoring, okay? That's the first piece, okay? It shows us that there are standards. I think, honestly, the church and the people in the church and Christians should hold a standard and call our people out if we see this stuff happening, right? That we should call out people for how they treat their families. Easy stuff. What then do we do about the killing piece? How do we fulfill that? Well, let me show you. Go back to the context first and foremost. This will tell us a little bit about this. First off, notice what it says. They go to the elders of the city. So in the Old Testament, you've got the elders of the city. These are the guys who are the ones, these are the officials. These are the guys who run their city government. And so they're to go before them, and they are to look at all the evidence here, and then as a result, they will take care of business. The same thing is true if you look at the context of Exodus 21. Remember in Exodus 18, there are already been judges put into place. And so when the people are to go do this, the first thing that we have to keep in mind is this is the punishment. These are civil laws. These are not telling families to just go out and kill. You can't do that. That's not whatever was prescribed. There's actually a lot of evidence for the contrary, which is that there's a process for how these are to go through. So once again, these are things that they go to the people, they'll bring these cases to the judges, and then the elders will have to sift through this. So that's another piece to keep in mind. In fact, as I'm getting ready for the next passage, the next one on murder, there's a lot in the book of Numbers talking about these cities of refuge. And people are to go and flee there, and then you're to present your case to the city, to the people there, and then they will determine whether or not punishment is due. So the Old Testament does not give this, hey, you just go out and blast, kill, right? So that's the next piece of this, that these are not verses for you to say, well, I got to take matters in my own hands, got a rebellious kid or whatever. That's not what that's for. Recognize that this was never meant for be in your own hands personally. This was meant to be in the hands of government. Okay. So that's another piece they understand. Here's the other side. Recognize the severity of the punishment. You know, last night we were in Bible study and going through the Baptist Catechism. And one of the questions from the Baptist Catechism, if I can find it right now and pull it up, in the Baptist Catechism, it asks the question, are all transgressions of the law equally heinous? And the answer is, some sins in themselves by reason of several aggravations are more heinous in the sight of God than others. And the point is that not all sin is equal. The idea that there are harsher punishments and consequences. And one of the things that God sets up in this passage is it's important to recognize that you got to get this honoring your family right. Why? Because really that affects all relationships. It affects your relationship to the Lord. It affects your relationship to authority that God sets over you. And so this is important. So recognize that these are harsh punishments that are doled out. Okay, so then the question is, if this is not for me, this is for government, what then do I do with it now? Okay, here's the other thing you got to think through. As a new covenant individual, if you're a Christian, you are no longer part of the old, you're part of the new. This does not mean, well, it's just irrelevant, right? No, it means all those things. The importance of honor, the importance, the severity of the sin. The question is, how then do we implement this as a new covenant people? Okay, first and foremost, you should probably think through in terms of what we have as a new covenant. It does seem like a lot of what the old covenant laws were are no longer carried over, only in practice, not necessarily in application or in wisdom. Let me clarify what I mean by that. Is there's certain things that don't carry over because they were related to the government. So God was setting up a government amongst Israel. Those are the civil laws. The church is not a civil entity necessarily. So those civil laws don't necessarily follow because we're not called to set up like a Christian government. We're to evangelize the world. Now, second question would be, what happens when governments become Christian? That's a good one. We'll get there. So there's that piece to think through. The other thing is ceremonial. We don't have a temple. In fact, we're told that our bodies are the temple, right? That the church is the temple. And so that being said, all those ceremonial laws for the temple are no longer relevant for us. That's why you get into Acts chapter 10 and rise up, kill Peter and eat. Like those laws are gone about clean versus unclean stuff. So that's another piece. So we recognize those don't carry over. What does carry over is the moral piece. The morality of the law carries over. And so that's important to keep in mind so that we are not called and charged as Christians to carry out that piece. That's the first piece. Now, here's the second piece. The question then is, okay, but what if a government is Christian, right? Because over time, as the church has grown and grown and grown, there are nations that are Christian nations. So what do? And that's a good question for the governments to ask. Because here's where we're at today. You know, obviously we leave this in the hands of the government today of whether or not they are to deal with questions like this. But it does bring up a good question, though, for where should a government get its laws from? And these things seem so foreign to us. They seem so outrageous to us because we have a government that does not, it kind of makes its own rules. And I do think that it would be wise for a government to look to the Bible. This seems controversial. For its rules. Now, I'm not saying that the government has to be a one-to-one correlation, but there is something I want you to go back to the passage, right? Let's see if I can skip back to the Deuteronomy passage for us, right? This is the key. This is a big piece of how God set things up. Harsh punishments. It says, all the men of the city will stone him to death. You must purge the evil from you, and all Israel will hear and be afraid. So the point of harsh punishments by a government, as Paul says in Romans 13, they carry the sword, right, is so that there would be fear in people fear in evildoers. Okay, so that being said, what I guess I'm trying to get into is, so the question I guess would arise, should a Christian government institute this? Okay, once again, we're a new covenant people. I don't know if instituting death penalty, things like that is necessary. But should there be laws against things like that? Absolutely, there should be laws against that. Absolutely, there should be laws on the books for dishonoring, for shaming, for striking, for like all of that should be in there. Because if we don't base it, and this is this whole question of coming about what happens, and this is where I've landed of recent, right? The government is going to base laws on something. And it's either going to be from the Bible or it's going to be something else. Just look now. There's no such thing as neutrality, right? A religious head is going to be at the top. And it's either going to be that they need to drive from our Judeo-Christian principles, or they're going to derive it from something else. Because they might try to say we can be neutral. They might for some time kind of take from those principles of old but rejecting the authority of it. But at some point, something else seeps in. There has to be something firm to fall back on. And so all that to say is it's a good question of how this stuff gets implemented. And I do think this is a great question to ask on the civil level of what is the role of should we have roles and rules against this kind of stuff? We already have about elder abuse and things like that. That's important, but should there be further, right? Should we go further? And people say, well, you can't legislate morality. Yes, but we do in some cases, and we do in some, and we don't in some other. So I know I'm probably getting into the thick of this kind of stuff. I don't know if you can settle all of that here, but I do want to just say, as we go through some of this stuff, it's good questions to ask. What do we do with it? And like I said, if you're not in government, if you're not a lawmaker, then it's hard. But if you're in government now and you are in civil service and you're part of lawmaking, then we've got to ask, from where do we draw our laws? And that's a tough question. And how do we implement and what do we, once again, I don't think with Old Covenant that it's an easy one-to-one. I think there's a lot there that it stays there because we're told we're part of the New Covenant. The Old Covenant has passed away. That's what Jeremiah talks about. That's what Ezekiel talks about. However, as a government today, if you're going to be based on something, and I do think we should come from the Bible, right? If we're going to be basing our laws on something, we should look at passages like this and just say, okay, so what do we do? That these are important. This was stuff that was so important. They said this needed to be part of it, that we needed to think through. And I don't think necessarily the punishments have to be exact because we don't have to do it that way. We're doing something different. But is there enough fear that will come from don't do this because it's serious? All right. I just thought I'd wade into that. I don't know if you tracked with me at all, but hope this was helpful. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.